Welcome to this week's Friday lecture, Resisting War, How Communities Protect Themselves by Dr. Oliver Kaplan. We would like to kindly note that the lecture is being live streamed and will continue to be public in our class YouTube page after that end. And please submit, if you're online watching us, please submit your questions and comments via the YouTube chat, and we will link them to our speakers during the Q&A section at the end of the talk. We want to remind everybody about the land where we are standing. For those of us at Stanford, we are in the land and territory of the Autonomy original peoples. We offer gratitude to the land, water, and air that surround us, and we pay our respects to the past, present, and future Autonomy peoples who continue to be present in their homelands and throughout their diasporas. Oliver Kaplan is an associate professor at the Josef Korbel School of International Studies at the University of Denver. He's the author of the book Resisting War, How Communities Protect Themselves, which examines how civilian communities organize to protect themselves from wartime violence. He was a Jennings Randolph Senior Fellow at the U.S. Institute of Peace and previously a postdoctoral research associate at Princeton University in the School of Public and International Affairs and at Stanford University. As part of his research, Kaplan has conducted fieldwork in Colombia and the Philippines. His research has been funded by the Carnegie Corporation of New York, the International Committee of the Red Cross, the Smith Richardson Foundation, and other grants has been published in the Journal of Conflict Resolution, Journal of Peace Research, Conflict Management and Peace Science, Stability, and the New York Times, Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy, CNN, and National Interest. And most importantly, Kaplan received his Ph.D. in political science from Stanford University and completed his BA at the University of California in San Diego. Jennings, welcome. Thank you.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you, everyone. It's a pleasure to be back here at the Bolivar House. So as a student here, this was one of my academic homes, and I would come to a lot of events and really enjoy the community here. So it's really a pleasure to be back. And I just want to send a special thank you to the staff of Bolivar House for helping organize the event. Elizabeth, Sara, Megan, thank you so much. I'd also like to thank Alberto Diaz-Calleros, who can't be here today, but offered me a very warm invitation to come. I'd also like to mention my former advisor and former director of the Bolivar House, Terry Carl, the director of the Latin American Studies Center here, who couldn't also be here, but I know is with me in spirit. And then I also want to welcome a few very special guests who are with us today. First of all, I want to welcome Eliana Vasquez, who used to be, until very recently, a key staff person in the political science department here, and was really one of the first people who mentored me and advised me and supported me in terms of pursuing my work in Colombia. She's a native of Medellin. And I'm just really so glad you could come here today, Eliana, and celebrate the work with me. And thank you so much for your support. So thank you. I'd also like to welcome a few other special guests that I have here today. So actually, I'm here not only in my home campus, but in my hometown from Palo Alto. And very fortunate to have my family here joining in the audience today as well. So my parents, Sue and Ron Kaplan, are here in the background. So really glad you could join. I think as I was doing conflict field research in Colombia, they were maybe, some moments were slightly concerned about that, but always supported me. That said, there may be a few stories I don't tell today, just so that their nerves are okay. And then in addition to that, I'd like to welcome my brother Ben, who's here, who always supported me throughout the project. And actually the book that I'm going to talk about is dedicated to Ben. So along with the campesinos of Colombia. So Ben, glad you're here with me as well. So and Sana, is the slides are going?
Not yet.
Okay, so great. So why don't I get started? I think the plan is to speak for about 40 minutes. They'll have ample time for questions. And so I'm really pleased today to share my book, Resisting War, How Communities Protect Themselves. The book was originally published by Cambridge University Press in 2017. It was actually originally my doctoral dissertation here. So it finally made its way to the public, which is very exciting. And then I also had the good fortune to be able to publish a Spanish translation of the book, which came out in 2020, published by Fondo de Cultura Económica, publisher based out of Mexico City, called Resistir la Guerra. And I'm just able now to share that both in Colombia and more widely. So it's really a pleasure to be able to share that finally back here at Stanford. And, you know, I think the real interesting thing that kept me motivated about this project was really the puzzle that I came across. And, you know, I think if someone had at some point told you that unarmed civilians would have a chance of surviving the challenging war zones of civil conflict, especially when they're facing heavily armed combatants, you might not believe this. And for a time, I didn't believe it either. But then I saw some very compelling examples that suggested that this was not only possible, but it was actually quite effective and quite common. But really the puzzle that comes up is when civilians are caught between armed groups and they're in a fog of war, what can they do? And so often there's an attention bias among scholars and among observers where we focus on the armed actors or we focus on the victims of war. And in fact, a lot of the people I interviewed would use the phrase like, we're olvidaditos, we're forgotten, nobody pays attention to us. And yet at the same time, there are a lot of examples that we maybe don't pay attention to of how civilians and communities are both surviving and even thriving and getting by in periods of intense armed conflict. And so in a sense, the project overall, it offers kind of a new explanation for patterns of violence, which is really rooted in the civilians themselves, and that civilians can take effective actions to reduce violence. So they, in a sense, explain variation in violence, and they can help explain the reduction in violence. And I think this is even more important today when we see continuing challenges around the world of international actors being limited in how much assistance they can provide to civilians. And so I want to start with just a very brief example that I came across in my fieldwork to illustrate the type of puzzle and issue I'm talking about here. And I'd like to contrast the experiences of two villages in north central Colombia, about 100 miles north of the capital of Bogota. This is a photo of the village of La India. And the other village that I compare with is one called San Tropel, which is really over these hills there, not far away. And these two communities, though somewhat similar, had divergent experiences. So in 1998 in San Tropel, paramilitary forces executed 12 woodcutters, and they actually dumped their bodies in the Carari River, which is seen there. A short time later in 2001, the same paramilitary group was preparing to kill 11 residents of La India, but they didn't. A community organization that had arisen there, the Peasant Workers Association, known as the ATCC by its initials in Spanish, came to these individuals' defense and advocated on their behalf, and the 11 people lived. And so this really, you can see this contrast between the two towns. It raises a puzzle. Why were the residents of La India able to act, and why were the individuals targeted in one community but not in another? And my argument is that really levels of civilian organization are key for explaining the different responses and behaviors of these communities. And so let's talk a little bit about community organization. This is really the first variable or the first key aspect of my argument. This is actually a picture I took when I went back to visit the community of La India in 2013. They're holding a community meeting here. And in short, I argue that this community organization enables nonviolent strategies that civilians can use collectively to affect outcomes of violence. And so the organization enables nonviolent capacity and those strategies to help affect the outcome of violence. And so when I think about communities, I really think about two types of organizations that they might use in these types of conflict conditions. One is what I refer to as formal peace communities, and these are organizations that purposefully organize to reduce violence to promote peace. And in this picture, the ATCC would be one of those types of communities. There are different ones called peace communities. One of the most famous ones is called San Jose de Apartado in Colombia. In other countries, they go by different names, such as peace zones or humanitarian spaces, things like that, but a very purposeful movement to organize to deal with violence. By contrast, I also look at another set of community organizations, which are what I call informal organizations or informal local organizations. And there are various types of these that might be important. There are either religious or maybe indigenous or tribal group organizations that can be important, especially in Latin America or in other countries. In Colombia, I specifically focus on one type of community organization that I came across known as the Juntas de Acción Comunal, or the community action boards. And these are a type of local village council that was originally developed to help with planning to provide public goods, like help repair roads, bridges, festivals, things like that. And in the context of the conflict, these organizations ended up being adapted to help deal with issues of violence. And so these kind of formed the nucleus of collective action at the local level. These organizations had inconsistent contact with the state. In some ways, because of state abandonment, these organizations help arise and increase community capacity. So I'd like to take a minute just to talk about some of the civilian strategies I see. And so in the project, I identify and analyze what I call different types of nonviolent autonomy strategies, or strategies for community autonomy in the context of the conflict. And by autonomy, what I really mean is that communities have the ability for self-rule in the context of the conflict. So they might make their own decisions of various types, including decisions about the types of harm or violence that might be visited on a community. So if someone, for example, committed a crime or some kind of abuse, it would be the community that decides how to deal with that situation and not an outside armed group. And so in thinking about these two types of strategies, I break these down into really two groupings. One of them I call covert or internal or hidden strategies. And these are internal facing strategies that communities may use that armed groups, armed actors may not even be aware of. They may not even be visible to them, and yet they may affect how armed actors are able to treat the community. And these include, just to summarize a few different things, one is different types of pro-peace norms or a culture of peace to persuade individuals not to get involved in an armed conflict, not to take their disputes to armed groups to be resolved. A second one is mechanisms that the community uses to resolve disputes among community members. This is another way to keep issues from leaving the community for violent resolution by armed groups. Another thing that communities might do, which is fairly common, is setting up different types of information networks for early warning. So if there's a pending attack or a risk, communities will organize nonviolently to pool information, identify risks, and be able to move out of the way or deal with them before they turn violent. So in addition to those covert internal strategies, I also identified a number of overt or external facing strategies that did involve direct interaction with armed groups. These include things like what I call an investigations mechanism. So this is a particular strategy that the community like the ATCC that I mentioned uses to investigate individuals who are under threat by an armed group and try to understand whether those threats are for valid reasons or for mistaken reasons. And then they would take that information and try to negotiate with the armed groups to desist from killing or targeting those individuals or buying them a second chance. Another one that we see, which is more public, is exactly the type of strategy we see zooming in on the illustration of the cover of the book here, which is a type of either dialogue or protest. So dialoguing with armed groups or putting pressure on them to leverage their reputations and concerns about being viewed in a negative way. Finally, one strategy that we see in some communities, which I don't focus on, is armed responses, so armed local responses. My book primarily focuses on nonviolent action because I think it's harder to distinguish when communities are sort of still civilian versus being an armed part of the conflict when they start using armed strategies. But I just want to acknowledge that those are one of the strategies that we see. So the next question that comes up is, okay, this is a nice framework, but how can we go about studying these strategies in these organizations, and how can we tell whether or not they have any type of effect? And because a lot of these nonviolent strategies that I just told you about are often hidden, they're often occurring far away from the camera lens, out of sight. To study this question, I really had to go out there, out to the communities, and out to the villages. And so, especially in Colombia, you know, this picture kind of sums it up. I had to take all different kinds of transportation to get around to some pretty far-flung places. In Colombia, if anyone's traveled there, in Latin America, there's the classic chiva or the country bus. There are jeeps, and in Colombia, actually, a lot of those are called Willys, which is kind of repurposed World War II jeeps. Motorcycles, bestias or mules, as they call them, lanchas or motor canoe to travel by river, and then just a lot of hiking on very muddy trails. So, you know, really getting out there to understand the daily lives of these communities was a really key part of this project. I just also want to mention the book contains some additional case studies from the Philippines, where I also visited, as well as some cases on Syria and Afghanistan, which I did not visit. I collected secondary information for that. So in addition, I studied a number of communities in depth and actually used mixed methods in political science, as we call them. So I used a number of different sources and a number of different analytical techniques. So I used statistical analysis and data analysis to do a larger analysis of the patterns across the whole country. I also was in these different communities doing participant observation, accessing local archives, conducting interviews, and conducting focused case studies. And so these are some of the locations that I visited. I studied a few cases in the Department of Caldas, west of Bogota. I also went to this area called Meta, which at one point was controlled by the FARC during peace negotiations in the early 2000s. And then I did deeper study of the community of La India, which I just spoke about, in the Department of Santander. And then I also did some deeper case studies in the Department of Cundinamarca, which I'll talk about in a little bit here. And so these cases that I selected, in particular in Cundinamarca, I'll explain how I selected them based on a larger data set of cases to understand where they fit among the larger amount of data on the Juntas de Acción Comunal, the community action boards. And so just to set the scene a little bit, in order to understand what I was trying to find out in terms of my research, it's important to have just a basic grasp of the patterns of conflict in Colombia. And this can tragically be summarized by the national homicide rate data in Colombia from the 1940s through the 2000s. And this homicide rate data obviously covers multiple types of violence, but it actually captures a lot of the conflict violence as well. And so in this diagram, you can see that I collected a lot of data on these civilian organizations from historical sources in the early 1980s. And that was a really important point to study because, as you can see, in the 1940s through 1950s, there was a really severe conflict in Colombia known as la violencia, or the violence. And according to estimates, something like 200,000 or more individuals perished due to inter-communal conflict, but also conflict, or I say inter-political party conflict, as well as actions by what later came to be known as kind of criminal bands. So that conflict really gave way to the two insurgent groups that have been in the news recently, and that in some ways are still continuing, the FARC and the ELN. The FARC had a peace agreement in 2016 and demobilized. Some people remobilized. The ELN group is still active, and they're discussing whether to start peace negotiations very soon with the new government in Colombia. But you can see that there was sort of a lull in violence for a time as those groups sort of first organized, expanded their presence. Then you can see really starting in the 80s, the conflict really heightened, and that's in part because the drug cartels expanded, but so did the different paramilitary groups in the country that organized to counter the guerrillas, to fight the guerrillas. And so once you had a conflict with the guerrilla groups, the paramilitary groups, and the government all involved, violence got very intense. And in fact, in the early 2000s, there was the US policy of the Plan Colombia, and in Colombia, the military campaign called Plan Patriota to try to push back on these armed groups, and especially the insurgent groups. And so the important thing to point out here is that I'm looking at civilian organizations that were founded from the 1960s on through the mid 80s. I'm taking a measurement of them really before the larger spike in conflict that I'm then going to study. And so I measure the organizations at a certain time in history, and then I try to see, well, what was their effect on later patterns of violence? And in particular, were communities that had higher levels of organization able to keep some of that violence at bay in the future? And so I'd like to illustrate this by taking you through a few of the case studies I conducted. And I've got just a few pictures to summarize these cases. I'm going to show you the cases that I mentioned in the western part of the Department of Cundinamarca, which is really only about 3 hours or so by road west of Bogota, the capital. And these communities were, for a certain number of years in the 90s and 2000s, very strongly under pressure by the FARC insurgent group, and then also at different moments the military, and later the paramilitaries had a small amount of presence. And so I compare the 3 towns of Quipile with 2 other neighboring towns of Vianney and Bituima. And Quipile I selected in part because the data suggested that they had very few juntas de acción comunal, so few standing community organizations. By contrast, the other 2 communities had very high levels of community organization, but yet they were right next to each other. So this kind of presented a puzzle. And here you can see a picture is actually from Quipile. This is a picture I took, and you can see there's the picture of a trash can. And you might think, well, why am I showing you a picture of a trash can? Well, this is one of the few projects that the local junta in the town center of Quipile was able to complete in a certain period in the early 2000s. And the kind of illustration of this is that this, instead of being a sign of successful community organization, it was actually the sign of very limited, ineffective community organization. And so you can see actually in the picture, there's trash on the ground. People had graffitied some of these. They complained about these trash bins smelling up the neighborhood because there was trash, out there on the street. And more than that, people said this was really the only thing that this community organization was good for, and it really reflected the low level of community cohesion in the rest of the municipality. And so, in this sense, the historical legacy of juntas and community organization in Quipile was low, so that by the time that the FARC and other armed groups came to this area, they were fairly quickly able to assert control, and the community and population suffered a lot of repression and violence as a result. So by contrast, like to show you a picture of a church, and this is the church in the town of Vianney, which is just north of Kipile. And when I got to Vianney, people started telling me about a story of a priest who had arrived in this town in the early 1960s. And this priest got there right at the time when the roof, shortly after, the roof of the church that I'm showing you had collapsed. And the priest took it upon himself to organize the community to rebuild the roof of this church. And he did that by, right at that time, Colombia was starting with the junta program, expanding juntas throughout the country. So he formed a junta and they came together and they helped rebuild the church. And people saw that as a very inspiring example. And other people in these communities took it upon themselves to form juntas. This priest went on to other communities in the municipality to form additional councils. And when I spoke with this, I actually was able to speak with this priest. I was able to find him while he was in retirement in Bogota when I did my fieldwork in Colombia. And he said that, this really made a big difference. He was inspired by the people, and the people, based on those activities, continued on that legacy. And so other people that I interviewed said, his legacy was that the people in this community and also in Bituima, right next door, never let the juntas die, that they continued on. There was a very strong legacy. And one of the community members, I remember, told me a very memorable quote when he said, "Para adelante cuando unidos, solos jodidos." And if you catch the Spanish, it says, united we'll move ahead, and alone or not cooperating together, we're screwed. And so, this really summed up, the ethos of these two communities. And what I found was that these nascent structures, even though some of the juntas had faded by the time of the 90s and 2000s due to some larger national level changes, that legacy of community cohesion lasted. And so I want to show you now a picture of a polideportivo. This is actually the polideportivo in Kipile, but the polideportivo in Colombia is a common site where people play sports. It's a multi-sport court. You have soccer, basketball, all kinds of things you can play there. It's often the main kind of outdoor space or meeting space in a community. And in a lot of cases, armed groups in Colombia would convene communities to meet with them there and to put pressure on them for their support. And in fact, this is what happened in the community of Bituima. When I interviewed some individuals there, they told me of a story at a certain moment in the early 2000s when the FARC insurgent group called all of the community members there to put pressure on them and to basically say to them that he who doesn't collaborate with the group will be killed. And so they wanted to get provisions and assistance and water. And people were pretty afraid by this, but one man stood up and he essentially spoke back to the armed group. And he said, "Look, Commander, you are not God. You are not the owner of life. You're not the one who decides who will live or who will die. And you don't even know if you'll outlive us, essentially with the army coming after you as well." And when he said that, everybody else, from what they say, stood up and supported this man, and the armed group had to back off. And so, when I study this example, this is one example from these communities, but I heard similar examples in several other communities around the country, and this was sort of consistent with the hunch I had based on this community's high level of community councils, that they would be more likely to mount these kinds of nonviolent autonomy strategies to protect themselves. Okay, so let's take a step and just zoom out a bit. If we think about these examples I just told you of Bituima, Vianney, of the ATCC, of Kipile, we can think about those in the context of a larger analysis of the data from across Colombia. And so I'm just going to summarize some of the statistical analysis I did here, but I looked at the data that was available on the number of junta councils across different municipalities in Colombia, and I compared that with some of the data on political homicides or homicides having to do with the armed conflict that are produced by from news sources by a Jesuit think tank based in Bogota called CNEP that I've partnered with. And one thing to just mention is for the data on the juntas, I only came across this data because I was meeting with someone in Bogota, and someone there showed me a book that he had with different indices in Colombia, and it had one page that had registration of the juntas that were present in the early 1980s. And I thought, wow, this would be really great data to use. Lo and behold, I was looking, trying to find a copy of this book, and I looked up the book in the Stanford Library, and of course, it was right here at Stanford. So I got all the way to Columbia to try to find sources, and of course, Stanford has such a great library collection that the book was there. I got all the data from the Stanford Library in the end. So, that happened multiple times where I just, I spent a lot of time in the Columbia collection and other collections in the library here, and it's such an impressive collection that there's just so many gems that you can find. And so a number of data sources and other texts I got here, and I just want to give a shout out of appreciation to Adon Griego, the Latin America librarian here. I'm not sure if he's watching on live stream or not, but thank you, Adon, for all the assistance. And so to summarize the analysis I did a regression analysis with a number of different control variables about the context of the conflict, demographics, geography, so things like intensity of fighting, elevation, population sizes, etc. And I examined what was the pattern of violence or the relationship between the junta councils and violence from that spike in the conflict that I showed you from 1990 to 2005. And what I saw was essentially this sort of summary of the result, that where you had in communities with on average low junta councils, you would see a higher amount of violence. And in comparison, communities that had high levels of these junta councils suffered on average about 25% lower rates of homicides. And of course, this is an average effect. So there could be, for whatever reason, communities with high levels of these councils that might suffer more violence, or for whatever reason, communities that were not very organized somehow managed to not experience that much violence. So it's an average effect. But this was a result that I saw as consistent with both the field research as well as consistent with what you would expect if communities were organizing themselves and then using nonviolent strategies to then protect themselves. And so I argue that the mechanism or the approach through which this works is the stories I told you about the field research, where communities were able to use these nonviolent strategies. And so one of the questions I also had was a concern about, what about the previous bouts of conflict that I mentioned from the 1950s, the period of La Violencia. And so there's some historical books that document the patterns of La Violencia, and I took some of that data and mapped it. This is a map of it, and it shows essentially just which municipalities were reported as having high levels of violence in the 1950s. And this was important because I was possibly worried that where I saw effective community councils, it might be the case that they're effective because they only, they were from places that were historically more peaceful. So if you're historically more peaceful, you're more likely to both be organized, and you're more likely to see less violence because you're just historically more peaceful anyways. And so for whatever reason, you're less likely to suffer the harms of conflict. By contrast, if you're historically more violent, you might see a continuing pattern of violence even decades later, and you may not be very organized because violence might make it hard to organize. And so this data was really important to try to check the strength of my result. And what I essentially found was that, if anything, the councils that I studied that were formed after this period of La Violencia were more likely to be, if anything, slightly more likely to be found in towns that had experienced La Violencia. And in fact, the formation of the councils in a number of communities was precisely the result of having experienced a bout of violence. People realized how bad the violence was, and they realized that it would be really helpful to organize some kind of community structure to bring people together to cooperate. So that gave me some reassurance about the statistical results. Okay, so we can just dig a little bit deeper into how and why these community councils might have been affecting patterns of violence. So really for me, I didn't want to just know, well, do communities affect this statistical index of violence, but I wanted to understand how are really communities affecting the decision-making of armed groups. So if communities are using these different strategies, how are the armed groups reacting and responding? What were their reasons for using violence? And how might their motivations change or their actions change based on their interactions with different types of communities? And so to understand this, I, in addition to the other interviews I conducted, I also conducted interviews with about 30 ex-combatants from various armed groups. And so I had some help from the Colombian government. Actually, this is one of their posters, the Agency for Reintegration. So you can see people kind of leaving their armed groups and entering civilian life. And so I, around Bogota, I went to different centers and I interviewed these ex-combatants, former members of paramilitary groups, as well as from the different insurgent groups. And I asked them different questions, including, how would you behave if a community was organized versus not very organized, or if they protested against your actions, or if they remained quiet? And there were a couple of different quotes that were very significant. One of them was from a FARC subcommander, so a guerrilla subcommander. And I was asking him this question. He said, well, it's kind of like this. And he put it in this phrase: a single swallow does not make a summer. And I thought, that's interesting. I have no idea what that means. And he said, well, it's actually from Shakespeare or maybe Aristotle. And I said, it is? And he said, yeah, it's a famous quote. And I said, okay. And so essentially what he said, well, let me explain it to you. When it's just a single individual, raising their voice or protesting, it's not really significant enough to pay attention to. But if it's a whole community, when it's a whole flock of swallows, we have to pay attention and we have to take them into account and we have to restrain our behavior. So I thought, wow, that's really, exactly what my hypothesis would predict in this sense. And that was really an important piece of evidence for the project. In addition, I saw some similar evidence from archival research based on the community of La India, the ATCC. And so that community, being a formally organized community, they would have a lot of meetings with different armed groups to try to protect their populations. And one of the things that they learned to do was to take very careful meeting minutes or notes of those meetings, in part so that the armed groups that had those meetings could not go back on their word. They basically had everything written down so they could say, oh, last time you said this in a meeting. And so as a researcher, this is really a phenomenal base or source of information to access, because it's basically like being a fly on the wall of these meetings that communities are having with armed groups. And so in this case, the ATCC, a neighboring, less organized community, we're meeting together with a paramilitary subcommander. And the other community, the less organized community, was trying to ask the subcommander if they could enjoy the same types of protection, of living without violence, as the ATCC had enjoyed, in part because of their organization. And they said, one of the members of the community said, well, what if we don't want you here? What if everyone raises their voices and says, no, we don't want you here? And the paramilitary commander responded very tellingly. He said, well, if it's the entire community, we would respect the decision. But if it's only 2 or 3 people who don't want us, we will stay. And so you can really see how the level of organization is significant in giving that backing to the community to push back against the armed groups. So one other quote from, there's the archival, some of the archival documents, including a threat letter from the insurgent groups, and then some of the notes that were taken by the community members. And so one other example I want to just discuss from these records is there was another meeting with a different paramilitary commander, and the commander here really shows how communities like the ATCC with their organization, in a sense, were able to gain protection because they kind of helped the armed groups solve a problem by keeping populations from engaging in the conflict, participating with another armed group. And so the commander says here that we believe we are complying with the accords or the agreements that we made between our group and the community. The campesino, the peasant, has problems when he, quote, compromises himself with the guerrillas. He who dedicates himself just to his family doesn't have to worry. That's not a threat, it's a suggestion. So you can see that, in this sense, a group like the ATCC that had this investigations mechanism was able to maintain its community from getting too involved with armed groups, and therefore reach these successful agreements. So finally, I just want to point out that some of my research, I've looked at where communities have taken these kinds of actions around the world. This was data collected a while ago based on open source press information. I would say that now there are even more examples of communities that have taken these kinds of nonviolent autonomy actions around the world, and scholars are continuing to identify them. One other just quick example I like to go over is the case of the Philippines. They have these very formal organizations called peace zones, and in fact, one of their strategies was to try to keep individuals from carrying weapons in population centers, so that there was less likely a chance of some kind of shootout or of armed groups coming through those communities with their weapons and engaging in conflict in the populated village centers. And what I was just thinking recently about the news is that, New York City is actually trying this very strategy, right? They're trying to put a ban on weapons and arms in certain areas of the city. I'm not sure how successful or whether they've been able to implement that based on court rulings, but a similar type of policy maybe. So, all right. So just to wrap up, as we look out on the horizon of the Caraya River, I interviewed one of the former leaders of the ATCC, and he really gave a quite insightful comment. And actually, I should take it back. It's actually a quote from the same individual from one of his diaries that I came across in the archives. And at one point in the early 1990s, the community had really been able to overcome its challenging period of violence from the 70s and 80s, and had essentially outlasted the armed groups. And he said, "To you that want violence, this ended in shit. For the right to life, peace, and work." And I'll just tell you that it rhymes better in Spanish. So, ustedes que quieren violencia, y esto acabó, carajo, por el derecho a la vida, a la paz, y el trabajo. And so they're essentially underscoring that, with these kinds of nonviolent strategies, some of these communities are able to outlast the armed groups who are either, defeating each other or essentially getting arrested or going out of existence. And so really the larger point of this project was to try to listen to and gather and translate the voices of individuals in these very challenging situations who don't always have a voice and who don't always get to share their models and their lessons. And so that was, I think, one of the biggest takeaways for me, and one of the kind of strongest commitments I have was to listen and to gather and to share. And one of the key final quotes that comes to mind from one of the community leaders, he said, "Peace is an everyday process." So essentially, these kinds of lessons, they have to be repeated, relearned, and repracticed again and again. If you stop doing that, challenging situations can return. And so, I think there's a lot of implications of this research for other countries in Latin America, other countries around the world, that essentially there are tools that communities and their supporters can use. And how different might things be if we invested more in civilian peacemakers and understood these kinds of strategies. In other words, if we really looked to civilians themselves as a source of peace. So with that, I'll close my remarks and happy to take questions. Sorry, I didn't hear you, but I guess anyone who has a question, feel free to.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, I can ask. Sure. So there's a place in Medellin called Comuna 13. I just wanted to hear your take on that because it seemed like first the FARC were embedded in that, and then in 2010, the government comes in and takes out a bunch of people, but they also hurt a bunch of civilians.
Yeah.
And then they paid back to a point where now to me, Comuna 13 is doing very well 10 years later. What I'm trying to figure out in your proposal is where does the government fit in this? And when we talk about because you use words like community leadership,
Yeah.
They're not politicians per se, but how are they connected to the politicians? And could you shed some light on your thoughts with the politics of it, maybe?
Sure. Yeah. So a few different aspects of your question. So the question was about Comuna 13, there was Comuna 13 in Medellin, and how communities there dealt with essentially an urban conflict situation, how that comuna has evolved since then, and how do the community leaders engage with state entities and politicians. And so actually I was able to visit Comuna 13 just before COVID for the first time. I'd been in Medellin and visited some other comunas in my very early fieldwork, but actually hadn't been to that comuna. I think at the time it was actually still pretty conflicted. And if you go there today, I mean, you can take a walking tour of graffiti and like the kind of restoration of that community. And so, if you're in Medellin, I encourage you to take a look or consider checking it out. But essentially, a number of the comunas or the urban barrios, neighborhoods in Medellin, for quite a long time were areas of intense conflict, not only among different cartels, but the different armed groups had their sort of urban cells in these neighborhoods. So paramilitaries had their sources and informants, and so did the guerrillas. And so that was a really key point of conflict. At a certain point, the military engaged in some pretty strong operations. I think it was Operación Orion. And so they went in to try to push out the armed groups in those areas, but they did it with a very heavy hand. And so the one thing I'll say is that this argument I would say applies more to rural communities than maybe urban communities, because the state is often more present. Conflict is often at a lower scale and for different reasons. But some urban communities, I think, with good leadership and good cohesion, are able to protect themselves. And in some communities, they've used different approaches, such as even gating off their streets or their neighborhoods to try to maintain security. In terms of the leadership, the juntas in Colombia, there really are more like village level structures, but it's kind of confusing because the government at one point basically passed a law saying, like, we're going to recognize these organizations as local nonprofits. You can form one if you like. And if you form one, it'll help you interact in part with the government. So you could get maybe some funding from the government for projects. You could get some technical assistance, things like that. You could interact with the city council better or the mayor, things like that. And so in some sense, it's kind of like a quasi-governmental structure, but I don't actually want to go too far down that road, because in a lot of the places in Colombia, the government is not very present. And so really in a lot of the places, these structures were really a local community-based structure. I mean, they would have some interactions, but it was really more about whether the community had its own capacity as opposed to sort of some larger political aims. That said, a number of junta leaders, a number of, let's say, aspiring politicians see the juntas, the junta councils, as a stepping stone for entering politics. So people might be the junta leader first. They may then end up going into city council or something like that, or moving up to another level of politics. And in some cases, the juntas became could become complicit in electoral vote buying or voting, let's just say corruption or things like that, or have sort of what you say, I guess capture might be the kind of political capture of the juntas, and so that can be a concern that they might be co-opted by, let's say, political actors or even by an armed group. So some of them certainly, maintained independence, would try to maintain independence. Sometimes they would get pressured by outside actors as well. So it is definitely a more complex story. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
How often that last section you talked about happened, the co-optation? Because as you were going through your presentation, I was thinking of the autodefensas in Mexico, my home country, which began as a very noble endeavor to fight drug cartels. But as time went on, there became a lot of speculation and a lot of very fair arguments that they were cooperating with other drug cartels to become armed. Was it a rather common situation in which these local groups became involved with paramilitary groups or cartels?
I'd say that's a question that's hard to answer. So the question is whether or not the juntas, for example, were very frequently co-opted. I think it's a hard thing to answer. It's very hard to measure from one community to the next. I would say a lot of people, there's been a lot of stigmatization of these communities where people are assuming that, oh, if there's a junta there, they must be operating at the behest of one armed group or the other, that they're not independent. And so, I think it certainly happens. I think even when certain communities leaders are, quote unquote, maybe co-opted, or they might have certain political leanings, they often will still try to advocate for the community. But this is the kind of question that's sort of a bit of a hidden thing. It's not really an easy thing to go around and survey people. Hey, how co-opted are you? They're not necessarily going to answer that. So it's definitely a challenge. I would say the stronger, more effective communities are often able to maintain their cohesion and maintain the accountability of their leaders. But certainly it's a possibility. So yeah.
Yeah, similar-ish question. So you mentioned that you focus only on non-violent resistance as opposed to violent one. I was still curious if you had any perspectives on the relation between violent and non-violent resistance within the communities that you investigated.
So this is a good question. I mean, in terms of the contrast between violence and non-violence, in Colombia, there were not that many instances of very organized local armed resistance or armed protection, let's say. In the later kind of the post-La Violencia period of conflict, during La Violencia, different communities were, I think, more likely to have armed against bandits and things like that, or against the other political party. So in the later years, there certainly are some examples of smaller communities, taking up arms or things like that. An indigenous group mobilized in an armed way and then later demobilized as sort of having an armed protection force. So in Colombia, a lot of the groups that armed nominally in self-defense ended up being the Autodefensas Unidas de Colombia, the United Self-Defense Forces, or the main paramilitary group. And so from there, it went very quickly from local self-defense immediately to, I'd say, to paramilitarism. And again, this is my sort of interpretation of it. And so in a lot of cases, like the case of the ATCC, there's evidence that they had discussed a lot of options, including arming, and they just realized that they were mainly, farmers. Maybe one or two had been military veteran, but they didn't really have military training experience. They didn't have weapons. The armed groups had much stronger capabilities and much larger arsenals, and that there'd be no match for these groups. If they decided to arm, they would immediately be blown away, and so blown out. So for those kinds of reasons, you saw a lot of organizing in a non-violent way, or in a more kind of community cohesion type of way. Now, there are some other examples from around the world where there have been sort of effective local armed defense movements that essentially stayed local. Like one of the examples would be Peru, the Rondas Campesinas, But even there, a lot of the weapons that the peasants or the communities had were mainly things like shotguns or maybe machetes or not very significant weaponry. And so some of that was more, I would sort of argue, more symbolic in terms of the effects that those arms had. In other cases, there are communities that are more heavily armed in defending themselves. But I think a lot of it comes down to sort of valuing nonviolence. In fact, in communities like La India, religious ideology played a very big role about sort of what was the appropriate way to behave, and that as a lot of the people there were, for example, Seventh-day Adventists or Pentecostal. And so they sort of had very strong beliefs against using violence and sort of out of their religion, very pro nonviolence. And so sort of those ideologies also shaped how and why people decided to respond to violence in certain ways. So
we have a few questions from the chat.
Okay, great.
So first, from one of our students, Sierra Wells. Hi, everyone. I was wondering what strategies, if any, Dr. Kaplan has seen for NGOs, institutions outside these immediate communities to effectively support nonviolent organization at a local level.
Sure. Thank you. And hello to everybody viewing online. Thanks for tuning in. So this is a really great question. A lot of the questions that I often get is how can we, if this is true and communities are organized, how can we support them? How can we help them? What can other NGOs and other actors do? And so I had the opportunity to look at this a few years back in 2017. I was able to go out on a delegation visit with the International Committee of the Red Cross, where they were trying to support communities in their own community protection efforts. And so I got to see how the Red Cross interacted with communities. And I would just say, like, there are a number of different organizations that do provide different types of assistance and NGOs. So things like Peace Brigades International is a big one that will accompany activists and provide observation. There are a number of church-based organizations. There are other humanitarian organizations like the Red Cross, the ICRC. But I was able to go out with the Red Cross, which is a very well-known and respected humanitarian organization. And they were doing various different things to try to support the communities. They were helping to try to hold meetings to bring them together, to share different examples. They would also provide them with some backstopping. So if there was a crisis in the community or some kind of risk, the community could call the Red Cross and possibly get some advice or help with early warning, things like that. They might help back them up if they were dialoguing with armed groups. The Red Cross being there, being available, would be a helpful instrument. So there's some various different roles that that these different outside organizations, these external supporters can play. They can provide resources, they can share lessons, they can help build community ties and cohesion. They can provide extra weight to dialogues and negotiations. So.
And then we have a question as well from Ryan Miller. How has the United States contributed to armed conflict violence in Colombia and Latin America? And what American policies have undermined communities' abilities to resist armed forces? And also, what strategies would you prioritize for communities in the US to better resist the military-industrial complex and the exploitation of armed conflict violence?
Okay, there's a lot in that question. So how has the U.S. Contributed? That's a pretty complicated question. And then, are there things we can do in the U.S.? So the U.S. has had a very close relationship with Colombia for decades, really, since at least the 1950s, if not earlier. The U.S. has provided a lot of military advising, support, resources. It's quite a controversial topic in terms of the effects of that support. A lot of people, I'm not going to take a stand here, but a lot of people argue that it's caused a lot of harm. Other people have argued that it's built up the structures of the state and the military to secure more areas. And so I'll just to give you an example, kind of in Colombia, depended on where you were located, how you viewed the Colombian government's let's just say like counterinsurgency or effort to secure the country, and the US support of that. And so people in the cities would maybe feel very good about that because the cities got largely secured with, sort of the perimeter of security was pushed back with military efforts. People could travel on roads again. Now, of course, a number of people were harmed through scandals like the false positives scandal, where the military ended up dressing up individuals as targeting them as and dressing them up as guerrillas to show that there were higher body counts. So like clearly there are problems. The towns that I studied in Cundinamarca, like Vianney and Quipile. So Quipile had a very traumatic experience. The Colombian military essentially conducted a raid where they rounded up something like 50 or 100 of the residents in an early morning raid because they were suspected of having supported the insurgents. Eventually, most of these people were let go, but it was sort of a traumatizing incident. And yet, other people in that town and the neighboring towns saw the military push to gain security as a very beneficial thing. A lot of people at that moment were very grateful to the government that increased its capacity and secured those towns. Now, of course, a lot of other people who were subject to various forms of repression, including being farther out, like by where the ATCC was, or other places that were more in the colonized lands, very different view of the government, very much less, more critical and not enthusiastic or feeling neglected. So I'd say, the U.S. support has been multifaceted, or the interaction. There've been a lot of development programs and things like that have been very beneficial. There have been support for military campaigns that people have viewed controversially in different ways. One of the things I think that is most interesting for this topic is the Peace Corps volunteers are thought to have played a somewhat significant role as promoters of the junta councils. So they, along with the example of priests and other social leaders, even trainers from the government, at a certain time were in these rural communities and trying to build their capacity. And so, I know that there are a lot of popular views about Colombia, drug war, all those kinds of sort of common lenses of looking at Colombia. And I think, one of the really important things to realize, and especially I think that comes out in this book, is that it's very complex, and for every community, it's a different experience. And I think my advice, kind of in general, would be, well, yeah, there have been a lot of militarized approaches. Let's emphasize these nonviolent protection approaches, which I think are much less risky in terms of the harm they might cause. Just to briefly touch on the second question, I think in the U.S., I don't want to necessarily talk about the military-industrial complex. That's way above my head, but I will say, I think that we have a lot we can learn from places like Colombia, Mexico, around the world. Other example, Ukraine, other countries that are dealing with conflict issues and finding ways to manage with conflict and violence and risks. And I think, in the US, we're, watching the news, we're in some maybe possibly precarious situation. And I think, learning about, how to promote pro-peace norms here and learn about nonviolence it's also very important. So I think that was a tricky question. Thank you, online student, but so.
We want to thank you for sharing such a in-depth and comprehensive field work that you have done. Thank you so much. And well, this ends our live streaming, and we want to thank everybody online for joining us, and invite everybody to join us next week for on Friday, October 21st at 1:30 Pacific time for the lecture with Dr. Alexis Wells Ogogome. So thank you.
What is next?